Hey everyone, Chat Sematary is back, and Mike Comite is joining me to discuss Thinner, which is a book technically written by Richard Bachman, but that was just a pen name for Stephen King at the time. And Mike, I know reading isn't something you get to do quite as often as I do, so thank you for taking the time to read this.
I'm so glad you just got me reading a book again. It's just, there's just so much, there's so many words in this thing, And it's not even a long book. That's the really embarrassing part about this. It's not even a long book at all, but.
To be fair, it's a normal size book, which Stephen King typically does not write. But for everyone else, this is like a pretty standard amount of pages here.
Yeah, it's an adult book. It's like I don't even want to say how long it took me to read this because I was reading like maybe like 25 minutes at a time, and then would take like a month break and then come back. Like when did this podcast start? Like
October. I dropped the trailer, and then November I think was the first episode.
And then I think I signed up for Thinner in like December, like late December, like before holiday break or something like that. And it has just been me just going back to the book and then closing it and then opening it. And then the last 50% of the book, because I'm reading it on Kindle, so it gives me percentages while I'm reading it and like time till the chapter.
Right.
It flew by. Like I finished the last half of the book probably in a week. Once I actually like sat down and committed to it. It was like, all right, stop reading comic books, stop editing audio, stop doing all this other stuff that you need to do with your life. Just read the book.
To be fair, I think the back half went faster for me too, even though I took maybe 4 or 5 days to read this because I have lots of time, unlike you. So, it's one of those things.
It's about how we use our time, and I need to be more responsible with mine. Like, reading is not a bad way to spend your time, I do want to talk about this, like, the difference between the first half and the second half of the book, but maybe we should start off by just giving a rundown of the entire concept of this book.
Yeah, I want to touch on the whole Richard Bachman pseudonym real quick, because I've never really paid attention to the backstory of how this came about. I just knew it was something that Stephen King had done because we have Thinner, which was written as Richard Bachman, and then there's the Bachman books, which is 4 novellas, I believe, that he wrote under the pseudonym, and one of them has been banned from publication, basically, for reasons. But it's...
Wait, what reasons? I'm so
Have you heard about Rage? His novella
No.
Rage? Okay, so quick background. I'll be getting to this in a couple episodes too as well, but he had this short story that they kept finding in the backpacks of school shooters.
Oh.
So they ultimately ended up banning it from publication. So if you buy a copy of the Bachman books now, it won't be in there. But because my mom was buying these when they were originally released in mass market paperback form, we have a copy that still has it in there. And I haven't read it, but it's one of those things where I don't think the pen name really had anything to do with him wanting to write that story. I think he would have written it regardless of what name it was under. But it's interesting that it was eventually taken out of circulation.
Like, I think about books being banned in 1960 and before, like I don't really think about books getting banned recently in like the last 30 years or 40 years or however long it's been since this came out.
And I haven't looked into it too much. I'll be doing this when I get around to reading it, but I don't think it was necessarily someone banned him from publishing it. I think he had a hand in the decision.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Yeah.
But don't quote me on that until I do the podcast on it. Double check.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I will listen eagerly to the Rage episode. So the Richard Bachman thing I had never heard of until you started doing this podcast. Like, I didn't know who Richard Bachman was. I didn't know that it was a thing he would do. And then at a certain point, I just thought that was his real name and that Stephen King wasn't his name, but Richard Bachman was his name. Like, I got it backwards. Like, I think Richard Bachman is not his name, right?
Right.
Okay.
The name comes with this photo of some random dude, I guess. There's an author photo, and I don't have it on my copy of Thinner, but apparently on the back cover of one of the copies of Thinner, I assume probably the hardcover when that first came out, it has this photo of someone who is not Stephen King. So it's like, I don't know if he got permission to use this guy's photo, but, it says that the Bachman pseudonym only lasted from 77 to 85. So that is something that is very interesting because he even did like posthumous releases for Bachman. after he quote unquote died. So it's a whole weird thing, but it's Stephen King, so weird doesn't surprise me at this point.
Just a Getty image in there. Just somebody else,
Yeah,
random.
I have no idea
That's
what it is, but apparently he was initially going to use a name that was based on his mother's father's name,
mhm.
but then he used a different writer pseudonym as inspiration
Okay.
and a band. So Donald Westlake had a pseudonym that he went by, which was Richard Stark, and then there was a band called Bachman Turner Overdrive. So he
Yep,
just
I've heard that
combined the
band.
two and got Richard
Okay.
Bachman.
Very nice. Okay, that makes sense.
Very weird. But yes, so back to Thinner, because I think this book has quite a bit to talk about as far as the character work and everything like that goes. But we did want to talk about how the second half of the book really blew by in comparison to the first half. And for me, I think that's because he was doing a lot of character building with Billy Halleck in the first half of the book. And then once we got to know the character, it was like, okay, here's the sequence of events that is going to happen going forward now.
Yeah, I got to the 50% mark in the book and was kind of just like, I don't know how he's going to fill the rest of this book up. Like, I'm looking at it and it says there's this many pages to go. And this is not just me being like, oh, I don't want to read. This is me just being like, what, like, where else can this story go
Yeah.
besides him, like, finding the person who cursed him and just being done with it, you know? Like, it was a very weird concept to me to get halfway and just feel like he had run out of story. But then he obviously surprised you because it's Stephen King.
Yeah, I think just because it was a bit slower of a pace at the beginning, you're like, wait, where is this going exactly? And then things just really heat up in the second half, and you're like, oh boy, there's so much happening.
Yeah, so I mean, this book came, I mean, I just based on what I read on the Wikipedia page, which I know is the ultimate source of information for all things truth. This was a book that he wrote after he was told to lose weight by his doctor or something like that.
Okay.
That's what it said on the wiki page, like the background of the book. So, take that at face value for a Wikipedia article. But he's like, what would happen? It's very like Chekhovian, almost like what would happen if you just kept losing weight? He kind of resented the fact, I guess, that he was told to. And then he created a character that was in his situation, was needed to lose weight, and then just started losing weight uncontrollably. Yeah.
It's funny because he recently released a novella with a similar kind of story too, with the whole weight loss thing in Elevation. He has a character who isn't cursed by a gypsy, but goes through something similar. So because I had read that recently, I kept thinking about that this entire time. I was like, okay, well, he can't have the same kind of ending because that would be weird to have the same ending twice with only slightly different stories. So I'm glad he went in the direction he went with this ending, because of the books I've read so far, quite a few of the endings seem to be hit or miss, because sometimes he'll add in these epilogues and you're kind of like, I didn't really need any of that, even if they're only, a few pages or something.
So do you think this book could have used an epilogue, or it didn't have the epilogue? Or
I think it was better executed without an epilogue. I think how he left it was a perfect ending for this character and his story.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about this. What do you think an epilogue would have looked like? I know we're just jumping to the end of the story before even talking anything about it. But I mean, I would assume that anybody listening to this podcast has read the book, hopefully, and is not just looking for like a chronological retelling of this. But what do you think an epilogue would have looked like for this? I have an idea, but I'm curious to know what you think.
I think he might have gone in the direction of following where the gypsies went afterwards, and maybe them putting a curse on someone else, because so much happens here, and then with the ending that we get, nothing good is going to come of it. Like, it's not a good ending for the characters, but it's a good ending for Stephen King.
Yeah. I would have expected something like maybe somebody happens upon, we like flash forward in time and we happen upon, like we flash past the suffering of the Halleck family, mm-hmm. and somebody happens upon them, or like there's another news article or something about a family that all starved to death, and like maybe Billy is blamed for like torturing his family or something like that, or really under like, or like a medical journal, something like that like kind of removes you. Like it's better off without it. I would never want that as the epilogue, but that's the kind of epilogue I would imagine would be unnecessary and put in there.
He does like using news clips in some of his books. That is something he's done before, so I would not have put something like that past him. But I'm wondering if because he wrote this as Richard Bachman, maybe he didn't want to have an epilogue that maybe would have given away his identity at the time.
Yeah, I think so.
But going back to kind of how everything started for Billy Halleck, basically he unintentionally ran over a gypsy because his wife was distracting him. And then the gypsy's husband or father, I think father, the dude is very old.
Well, it turns out it's the woman's father.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
But we find out like he's the great grandfather of somebody else.
Right.
You know, like the dude is like 100-something years old by public records.
Yeah, he is super old, but they can't pinpoint how old he is, which was a little funny bit in there where they were like, "Oh, he's this age, but maybe this age, or maybe this age, but we're going to go with this one."
Right. And I mean, at one point you have Billy Halleck actually meeting him again and saying, oh, he looks like he was 300 years old, you know, like, which is, you know, they use a little like throwaway line. It's probably not a throwaway line, but it's a very off the cuff and not re-examined line. Like he's like the last of the Magar, or like something he says he's like the last, he's like the chief of something, like he's the last of some lineage of,
right.
of Romani people. Like that's the other thing about this book too, you know, like I think, and it shows its age, like the term, I say it now because I think we have to say it because it's throughout the book, but the term gypsy is a derogatory term. It's a slur. And like the appropriate term is Romani people, like, and they talk about the Romani language in this, but like I think the politically correct term is Romani, and so it feels weird to read a book with this many, you know, words, like repetitions of that word that hasn't really aged well. So I think also we should probably address the fact that we're going to say the word gypsy a lot during this podcast.
Yes.
I don't know that if it's I feel ignorant to not be able to say if it is offensive or not. So I'm going to try and use Romani when I can, but the word gypsy is going to come up occasionally in this podcast because that is what he says a lot. And that's just I feel like it's important to point out.
No, it's definitely one of those things where with a lot of these late 70s and 80s books, you can tell when they were written by some of the language that Stephen King uses. But the thing for me is the fact that he has basically caught up with the times with his writing. If you read one of his new books, you aren't going to see remotely the same language in them. And, you know, he's someone who is very outspoken on Twitter. So he's not sort of the old white man who is stuck in his old ways, which is nice and kind of refreshing, honestly, these days. So, you know, it's one of those things where reading these books, you can get a little uncomfortable with the language because it's 2019 now and you're like, oh, I don't really want to be reading some of these words. And, you know, like you, I'm not really sure with this book as far as what ended up being derogatory at a later date or not, just because I'm not familiar with these people as much.
Yeah. I think the general idea is that you would not call a Romani person a gypsy.
Right.
I think that like that's probably a thing nowadays. Like you would not say that somebody's that. But I mean, it's difficult to talk about. And I think this is something about King. If I can speak more broadly again, really briefly about King. That kind of gets criticized a lot by people now in the same way that people will look back at old Twitter accounts, although we're talking 50 years of literature, right? At this point, how long has King been writing for? Like 40, 50 years? He's in his 70s.
It's definitely been since like the mid 70s, I think, was when he really started getting published.
Okay, so we're talking, close to 50 years of writing, if not that. And so, like, that's half a century of social change that is to be examined. So, like, when we talk about looking back at somebody's Twitter account and looking at somebody's, like, the tweets that somebody may have made
10 years ago or whenever
or
Twitter
even
started.
Less, like 5 years ago, and be like, oh, like, digging up Edgar Wright's tweets from whenever, you know, or digging up Gunn's tweets, the Guardians of the Galaxy director, or something like that. Like, those things happened, like, 8 years ago, you know, like, maybe 10 years ago, like you said. Like, these are... Like, we're talking about looking at literature from half a century ago almost, where, like, it wasn't right, the things that were written back then. And, now we have to contextualize that in the same way we would contextualize like slave narratives or something like that written by white people or anything like that we're studying. It's really hard to reframe it in your mind that way. And so what King gets accused of a lot nowadays is like having the idea of a mystical person of color in their novels, like whether it's like
The Green Mile.
yeah, The Green Mile, Stand.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you point to any Stephen King novel, and there's usually The Shining. Like there's just usually characters from his novels that are usually black and have some kind of power, and that is their function in the plot. And he may treat these characters well, he may treat them poorly, but he does that to all his characters, so it's not to say he's discriminating, but typically he will give a person of color some kind of mystical power, and this book is no exception. Like this, the fulcrum of this book is the Romani people, and they are given this mystical power, this curse. But I also think that the way that he talks about the Romani people is different, because I went for the first half of the book, like I'm looking at my notes now, just being like, I think there's a couple notes that I wrote in here was like, I think I hate Stephen King, like this just being the way, like whether he used the N-word or something like that, or, which is always, he's doing it through a character. So I fully understand that it's not him, but it's a choice he's making and trying to be conscious while I'm reading it. And then halfway through the book, he has Billy Halleck go through this realization of what the Romani people go through. So it's like he talks about how these people are like they become almost sympathetic to the Romani when Billy starts to realize, what they've been going through and the way that they've been ushered out of his town, and comparing his town of Fairview to what the life they have to lead is, and how they really weren't doing anything by just hanging out in the park and, grifting a little bit and taking advantage of some rich people and juggling and, taking crack shots with a slingshot. Like, that's really not doing anybody harm. It may be considered, quote unquote, an eyesore, for the town to have these travelers through town, these nomads, and then they're ushered out of town and like fined or given tickets and just treated terribly and pushes them out. And you're on the white folks side for the first half because they curse this man, and then I think it's probably when Billy gets to meet, or when they start talking about the journey of the Romani from Fairview up the coast, up the Northeast to Maine, of course, of all places, a Stephen King novel having something to do with Maine. It's crazy.
Shocking.
Yeah. So I just thought that was a really interesting part of the book is the shift that it goes through 50% of the way through, pretty much, where you start to see the other side of this. And I think that's a huge element of this book that I do really want to discuss, and that's the concept of the push. Mm-hmm. Did you find that interesting at all, or anything remarkable about the push, or the push as they write it a lot in the book, the push?
Yeah, it seemed like Billy was trying to, gamble in that moment, because when you're gambling, a push sort of means you and the house split it, kind of thing.
Right, it's a tie essentially.
Yeah.
It's his rationalization of the whole thing.
And it's such a weird one. It's like,
yeah,
okay, yes, we understand that running over the woman was an accident. And it's interesting to me that the wife never really feels that bad about it, even though she was the one distracting him. And she really just seems to have moved on very quickly from it, while Billy is sort of still trying to cope with what happened. And then you have this entire storyline in the second half where we're getting to know these people, and they really just want to be left alone. Sure, they're going and doing their tricks and telling fortunes and things like that, but really, are they harming anyone if the people are willingly spending their money on those things? And it's one of those things where you can see why the father would be upset, even though, they were both kind of at fault, because as I'm sure living in a busy city, walking out from between two cars is a very dumb move.
Right. Well, I think that's the really impressive thing that Stephen King does, or Richard Bachman does in this book, is that he gets you to completely align with Billy, pretty much throughout the whole first thing, you see him as the victim.
Until he
You
brings the
see that there's-
mobster in, pretty much, I would say.
Yeah, pretty much.
Even a little before that.
I would consider that the halfway book.
Yeah.
It goes back and forth because the beginning, he does a really beautiful way of telling you this story. You know, like he starts after the weight loss has begun and tells it through flashbacks, whether it's a dream sequence or like a sudden flash or newspaper or like something like that. You know, he's recounting these things. So essentially Billy, you know, hits this Romani woman as she comes out between two parked cars while he's being distracted by his wife in the passenger seat of their car, and he strikes her and she dies, and he's being charged with vehicular manslaughter, unintentional, you know, like, but it's still a charge of murder nonetheless, or not murder, I guess manslaughter is different, but and he gets off. You know, he gets off without a slap on the wrist. You know, I don't think he doesn't even get his driver's license revoked. He doesn't get anything revoked. No negligence or anything like that. It's just dropped, and the Romani people are sent on their way, and that's it. You sense something as corrupt. Like, as someone reading this in 2019, you're reading it and you're like, okay, so this does sound like white people, you know, taking advantage of people of color and you know.
And the system and their money and everything like that.
And the system, yes, exactly. Yeah, rich people taking advantage of the poor, and, you know, getting off, which we see every day in our society here. And then it moves into the idea of justifying the action. And there's a point where he, like, I think it's when Billy is telling either his wife, Heidi, or I think it could be the doctor, it's someone, maybe the detective.
Okay.
I don't think he can fight a detective. It's when he's literally spelling out, he's like, this is what I'm going to do when I find Tadeusz Lemke, which is the name of the patriarch of this family, the Romani family who's cursed him. He's like, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell him that, like, I'm sorry for everything that happened, but this isn't going to bring him back. And if we want to be fair about this, she came up from between two parked cars where the crosswalk was further down the road. And if she did the crosswalk, it would have been fine. And you start to believe him because he's the only point of view you're getting. And that's what I think is really remarkable that King does, is that he takes you into this thing where you're sensing the corruption at the beginning, but then he actually walks you through it and you're like, oh man, this dude is really getting the raw end of the deal here. He's being punished for something, you know, that he didn't, like, it's not his fault that he hit her, and it's his wife. Like, you start, I don't think I ever committed to thinking that it was ever Heidi's fault. Billy definitely did, you know.
Right.
I think Billy completely blames her, and doesn't really take any responsibility.
I just thought she would have felt a little more guilt than she did, because she just didn't seem to really care to acknowledge it as much as Billy did.
Fully submerging that.
Yeah.
She was definitely like, she was just smothering any guilt and trying to redirect and focus on Billy. I think, like, if I had to guess what that character's motivations were, just like accepting it means it's real, and then it would be too much for her to handle. So her mind just has to build jungle gyms around, you know, like what the actual problem is underneath.
Yeah.
So she can get over it. But yeah, I mean, when he's describing that, you feel for him, and then it comes the idea of this push that we brought up a few minutes ago, which is, it's in Vegas, like you said, when both sides kind of call it, and there's like, okay, that's it. And Billy, when he finally confronts Lemke, he says, you know, listen, this is what they call a push. He tries to explain his side of the thing, you know, saying, like, she came out from between two parked cars. You killing me is not going to bring her back. We both have to deal. You have to carry the death of a loved one, and I have to carry the fact that I killed someone on my shoulders. And this is a difficulty, you know, and we're both getting a raw end of the deal. And by killing me and suffering this way, taking me away from my family, taking a father away from my daughter and my wife, you know, that's worse than, you know, the fact of, like, just carrying this vehicular manslaughter on my shoulders is the worst part. And Lemke is like, no, there is no push. You know, like, he refuses to consent to the idea that this is like, that him just having to deal with killing someone is going to get off easy. Like, that's an even split. It's not. And you start to see that, and like, I don't know if Billy ever comes around and agrees with that, because he just wants the curse taken off of him and he consents to it, you know, with the whole pie thing, which we can definitely get into.
Yeah.
But he says, yeah, this is not like, he believed that it is a push, and Lemke says it's not. And I personally had to agree with him at a certain point, saying, like, yeah, I mean, it's not a wash, especially when he won't accept the guilt himself. Like, you see what, like, they manifest the guilt into a literal physical object, a piece of pie with something, the curse inside of it. And, you know, if Billy really truly believed it was a push, he would not try and put that guilt on somebody else, I feel like.
Yeah, and to dive into the pie situation a little more, his plan ends up being to let his wife eat the pie. And I think that has just
It's
culminated
grotesque.
over the
Yeah.
entire story because he's the one feeling guilty about this thing and she doesn't seem to be bothered by it. So I think that just built up inside him this entire time they were telling the story. And he was like, okay, you know what? She hasn't felt guilty at all, or at least expressed that she was feeling guilty at all. So I'm
Right.
just going to let
She hasn't
her.
apologized,
Yeah.
you know.
And then, unfortunately, the daughter comes home early and eats some of the pie. And then he's like,
Yeah.
oh. And, that moment of regret is one that he can't take back. So now he's
Right.
living with even more guilt. And that's sort of where the story ends for us anyway.
Right.
They probably all go on to die pretty much.
King always ends the story. It's not the end of the story, but there's no other possible outcome.
Yeah.
And that's something he does consistently in every book. It's like it's either the character is about to die or, like the villain has died or something like that, and it doesn't matter what happens after. Like the fact that Halleck's entire family is going to suffer in ways that we don't even know. Like Halleck may start getting thin again. Linda, his daughter, may something else happen. Probably will get gross or something like that. Like her face will probably have something like happen to the other characters that were cursed. And his wife will probably have something else happen to her. Like the curse will manifest in different ways, but they're all going to suffer and die because of it. But it doesn't matter. Like we may want to know the answer, but it's kind of like Pet Sematary. Have you guys talked about Pet Sematary on this show yet?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it's like that. The end of Pet Sematary, I feel like, is like he doesn't meet the wife as she's coming back yet, right? But you sense that it's about to happen, and it kind of just the book ends.
The wife walks in, and he doesn't call the person his wife. He says it came back.
Yeah.
And all the wife says is darling, and then it ends there. And you don't need anything else. And
exactly,
that's one of my favorite endings too, because
so good.
Yeah, it really is. And I think, I can't wait to dive into it, even though it's a massive undertaking. But I just know so much of that story already from watching the original miniseries and watching it, the remake recently. And, chapter 2 is coming out this year.
Yeah,
and
that's going to be big.
It's going to be massive. And I'm expecting to be unsettled a little by the language in that too. That's something that some of my friends who have read that have already warned me about because, again, it's a book in the 80s. And I'm fully expecting some of these things to make me uncomfortable. But I think what King does with his character work in general is what makes his stories so enjoyable. If we didn't have this push and pull between Halleck and Lemke, this story wouldn't be as good as it is. But because those characters both really know who they are and really stand their ground, that's what gives us this great story by the end of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the unstoppable force meets the immovable object. It's like it's a really, like, Halleck is determined and so is Lemke, and so there has to be like an interloper in all of this that comes and kind of swallows up both parties, which is Janelli, which I think is a really great point of conversation. Just this character, this Italian American. As I am an Italian American, I felt semi offended by this caricature, but you know what? It's fine. I'll stomach it. But Janelli. Wow, what an amazing backwards exposition to this character that we get.
Yeah.
Like we have no idea who Halleck is calling when he's introduced, and it's very functional. Like his introduction,
right?
The reader doesn't need to know that Halleck is calling this person and being like, hey, just so you know, I might need you for something. It's like, okay, that was a very odd scene, but I feel like it might come into play later. It's very clearly foreshadowing.
And it felt very clear that even Halleck didn't know the full extent of what Janelli was going to do. Because
no, he couldn't.
He knew this guy because the guy had hired his law firm, basically.
We find that out later, though, right? That's kind of what I mean by the backwards aspect.
Yeah, they do it backwards, but I think even though Halleck knew he should call this guy, he didn't really understand what he was getting himself into when he called him, when he made that call. Because
I
as we
think he
see
did.
that unraveling, he's like, I don't want you to hurt anyone. It's like he has to be very specific, even though, if the guy is an underground mobster, he's probably going to hurt someone. So it's like, why did you call this guy if you didn't want anyone getting hurt?
I feel like that was more Halleck covering himself, though.
Yeah,
So
true.
I think that when Halleck made a call to an Italian American gangster who was convicted, because that's the thing is like I think your perception is totally correct until you read the last chapter of the book or the second to last chapter when they do that news article about Ginelli's death, and all the things that he's been held guilty of. Or that he was accused of, and how the witnesses that were going to testify against him were all suddenly murdered, very, very suspiciously murdered before their trial. So but I think when you know that, you can reflect on Halleck's move to bring in Ginelli, and the fact that like Halleck had done everything he could. He'd hired a detective. He had gone to indulged his wife and the doctor but he went and investigated the other people who had been cursed as well too. Like this is a very well compartmentalized book, and if you look at the first 75% of the compartments on this train, you're like, okay, this makes very much sense. Like Halleck is a well-meaning person, but then if you look at the final, like the caboose on this train, you're like, oh, something's like this kind of weird stench that it's been coming from the caboose, and the caboose tells you that Ginelli is just he's been suspect from the start, and Halleck had to have known this, working so closely with him, and Halleck saying this is the like, oh, don't hurt anybody, please don't hurt anybody. When Halleck's final, like Halleck, he laughs as he throws Ginelli's dismembered hand into the trash.
Yeah.
He just has a cackling foot. And sure, he's been through a lot. Yeah. He's gone through a curse, and he's been brought back from the curse, and he looks like he's coming out on the other side. It's got to be gleeful for him. But he's getting ready to feed the pie to his wife. They don't even show a deliberation period in the book. Maybe it happens, but they don't really even show he doesn't have a lot of pause when Lemke is taking the curse off and into the pie and saying, like, are you sure you want the curse off? Because you've got to give this pie to somebody else, or else you're gonna get it twice as bad next time. Like he doesn't even hesitate, and they don't show a mental process of him being like, he's like, no, yeah, take it off, just take it off. So going back to Ginelli, I think that Halleck knew what was going
in the back of his mind. He always knew.
Yeah, he'd exhausted all lawful methods of doing this. Mm-hmm. And kind of like entering into the dark, like the gray area of private detectives trying to trace the Romanis up the coast. So Ginelli, love him, but he was scum.
Oh, absolutely. And you can say the same about Halleck once this all goes down. He just devolves so quickly, and it has to do with the weight loss, but it also has to do with the fact that nobody believes him. So then they all think he's sort of losing his mind and want to put him in a clinic and all of these other things. And, his wife basically turns against him with the doctor. She signs some form or something to have him committed as soon as he's found, basically. And I think that maybe was the final straw. And that's why we didn't have that deliberation when Lemke gave him the pie. He was like, okay, well, my wife didn't believe me. She didn't feel guilty. She turned on me. She just wants to think I'm crazy at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And you really feel that building up in him. And, even Lemke tries to get him to eat the pie himself. He's like, you should just eat this yourself. And he doesn't even consider it.
Yeah, if you really want to be a man or something like that, like you gotta man up and take the guilt. You're like, take the blame. Like you did this, so you have to suffer for this. And like, there's still a part of me that believes that it was unfair that Lemke did this, like to Halleck. Like, there's still a piece of me like, nah, like I don't like. Essentially, it's like an eye for an eye, really.
Yeah.
And if you don't subscribe to that belief of an eye for an eye, no matter how well Lemke describes the plight of the Romani people, and them being pushed from place to place for history, like for all of their history, they've been subjected to being treated like less than people who have a place to live, or people who have money, or people who don't make their way around nomadically. Like, no matter how Lemke describes that, there's still a sliver of you, if you don't believe in eye for eye, that believes that this is unjust, that he shouldn't have to die, that maybe this is a push. But it's the final action of Halleck that really illustrates to you how how it is not a push, I feel like.
Right.
And Janelli being involved in it somehow, another way that they really firm up that Janelli is truly scum is they really need to establish that Janelli's not doing it for Halleck.
No, not at all.
King goes as far as having like at the end of a chapter, and he just goes like, Janelli, just tell me again that you did some of this for me, or that you did this for me, at least part of this. And Janelli's like, hey, like if that helps you sleep at night, pretty much, like something to that effect. Like, and for me, that was just like, okay, we need to be, number one, okay with Janelli getting his just dessert, so to speak, like getting got, as we say in the business, versus like also just to inform us of, the idea of the push and being and accepting like, okay, like he is bad and also Halleck is bad. Like, and the fact that he did it for himself is how we learn that, not for his friend Billy, which is like maybe a part of it. The same way that Billy is, going to murder his wife, to save himself, like Janelli's going to help his friend out to make himself feel big and manly and macho and powerful, something he gets off on clearly.
Yeah. One of the interesting things with this story, though, and they kind of put this in more in the background, is the fact that he didn't just place one curse on one person. You have other people. So it's not really an eye for an eye. It's kind of like an eye for three eyes as far as Lemke's concerned. And that's when it really feels like, maybe he did take it too far, because it's not like Halleck straight up murdered the woman. It was an honest accident because, everyone at some point gets distracted while they're driving. It's just something that happens.
Sure.
Not necessarily in that same way, but it's one of those things where, you could have something happen in a split second and not be able to react as fast as you would if you hadn't been distracted for a moment.
Yeah.
And the fact that Lemke then punishes other people, the judge starts growing lizard scales and one of the police officers gets disgusting acne and ends up killing himself. It's one of those things where, I feel like that could have played a little more importance in the story, but it feels like they were like, okay, he didn't just do this to Halleck, but we only get short glimpses of what he did do to those two people.
Yeah, I think the idea of the honest accident kind of gets thrown away with the idea of the push and everything, and the discussion of the push, or actually, it falls on how you feel about the push, whether you think it's there or not. And for me, I think the eye for an eye thing, and like thinking about whether it was deserved or not, it comes in the idea of what two forces are working against each other here. And I think you could call it old world, new world. You could call it the mystical versus the civilized society. But like that's essentially who Lemke is taking revenge on. Because let's say the civilized world, if we're to consider the Romani people uncivilized, as the book is portraying them, let's say the civilized world had taken care of Halleck in the right way. The right way being him being jailed. Obviously, I don't think vehicular manslaughter, I do not think comes with a death penalty.
No, I don't think so.
It would not make much sense if it did. So, the worst that our society can offer to Halleck is jail time, which would probably not very long because by all means, like if you look at it black and white, it was an accident. But the revenge that Lemke is taking is in retribution for everything his people have suffered for centuries, and he's doing it because even if Halleck had gotten some jail time and had been given vehicular manslaughter, he probably still would have touched all those people outside the courthouse. This was like very old world justice, eye for an eye, like we've been going with, and it's hard to say if Lemke would have cared had our society delivered the justice necessary. This is like two tribes essentially warring. And it doesn't really matter which one, because they're never going to see eye to eye on this. I think that's also something that gets said, I'm paraphrasing, but gets put forward, is that like they're never going to be on the same level communicating. And that goes when, think about the fireside chat that Lemke and Halleck have, that his first confrontation with them, with the Romani at the fire, when he puts his forehead to his forehead. Like it's kind of like he's trying to level with this person, but he's never going to be able to. It's like a very amazing picture in my head of this taller, gaunt person trying to level with this person who's just on a totally different height, missing his nose due to skin cancer, it sounds like. Just yeah, it's just, that's what this book is, you know, like you could look at the conflict of the person, the man versus himself, but it's really just man versus man. Halleck has everything stacked against him. He has nature, which is like his body, I would say, his mind, his himself. He has another person against him. He has society against him. It's like every conflict that you can identify, you know, outline in literature is in this book. I think King has a lot of that. Like he'll put many forces against his main characters, but this book seems to like have an equal scooping of each one, I feel like.
Yeah, and really it doesn't matter that it was Halleck who ran over the woman and killed her.
Right.
You know, it was more the symbolism of what has happened to
Absolutely.
Lemke's people this entire time throughout decades, like you said. And it works better because Halleck is a lawyer who has money, I think. If this was someone who wasn't as well off, you know, I don't think the story would have the same kind of impact, but Lemke would probably still feel the same way.
Yeah, I feel like consider, what if it was like a negligent teenager?
Yeah.
That was in the driver's seat, you know, like who is like shuffling with a cassette tape. Those were around back in the, whenever this was, the 80s,
Yeah.
right? Like a cassette. He's like fishing around in the passenger seat and he looks up. Like Lemke still would have taken retribution
Right.
on this kid probably because of what that kid represents. Like the fact that it's a kid driving a car, you know, like it's what it represents. Yeah, I mean, it's you know, I think everybody knows somebody who has suffered, you know, in an automobile accident. I think, you know, you and I being similar ages in America, it's probably like one of the leading causes of death. And so I think everybody can find themselves on either side of this, whether they've been in a car accident or whether they know somebody who's suffered as a result of one. It's really easy to see both sides of the conflict in this.
Right.
And it's really hard to align with either character wholeheartedly. You're always going to have one foot on one side of the fence and one foot on the other. It's just it's a really interesting situation they put you in because the hero is not a hero.
Yeah, there isn't one. There isn't a single person who is wholly right and one who is wholly wrong. It falls somewhere in between. And while it might not necessarily be a push, it's getting close to one by the end of the book.
Right. Yeah. I mean, they want you to believe it is.
Yeah.
And then in the end, you do see that maybe that like the push has to be in Halleck. Like Halleck's, like it does come back twice at him, so he might as well have just eaten that pie again after Lemke takes the curse off.
Yeah.
He might as well have just eaten it again because the curse does come back at him twice as hard. No, even if he didn't do it himself, you know, like even if he didn't eat it all himself, now he has to watch the two people, or I mean, his daughter he loves. Like, I mean, let's talk about the fantasy he has at the end. Prior, like he drifts off to sleep knowing that his wife is about to eat the pie downstairs and that his daughter is in Westchester County, you know, far away from where he is. Maybe not too far, but far enough away that he doesn't have to worry about her coming home.
Right.
And he drifts off into a fantasy where he has forsaken his law, you know, his Fairview, his New England life, you know, of opulence and everything, and he just moved to Arizona, I think Phoenix, something like that.
Yeah.
He moves to Phoenix, and him and his daughter, because his wife is long gone, died from whatever curse he's given her, and you know his daughter's off at college and coming back home, and he's just living this simple life, doing the law he needs to do. And he wakes up and he goes downstairs and he sees that the pie, half of the pie is still, or like a quarter or a third of the pie is still sitting there. That the daughter came home in the night. With on a Greyhound bus because she was so excited to see her father.
Yeah.
That he was coming home, and the wife had some, and the daughter had some, and now he's got to eat the curse pie. Oh man, what's the name of that pie? It's got a really cool name. I mean, it's a Romani term, but
I just know it was strawberry pie.
it's just like the cursed child.
Yeah.
I mean, it was like definitely disgusting curse pie. Looked like strawberries. The description of Lemke massaging the pie too. Vile.
Yeah, and the fact that it was pulsing, like it had a heartbeat, kind of, but
still warm after how many days of Halleck traveling?
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah, that was very creepy. And then the fact that strawberry pie was the wife's favorite pie, It's like, okay, did
Yeah.
Lemke know in the back of his mind that this guy was going to give the pie to his wife all along?
Right.
Because, Lemke seems to know things that he probably shouldn't know.
Oh yeah, yeah. He can see things. He's got the sight.
Yeah,
Similar. I think is that like The Shining? Like
kind of.
I don't
Yeah,
know.
yeah. It's
Yeah.
something very similar, and that's something that Stephen King really likes to use a lot. But really, in this story, it's the daughters who suffer the most.
The daughters plural.
Yeah,
Oh
because
yes, you're
Linda
right. You're right.
Linda ends
Yes.
up dying in the end, even though we don't really get to read anything about that. But then, the accidental death of the daughter in the beginning that starts this
Yes.
whole
Yes.
thing. And it's like
That's true.
two of the most innocent people, even if, Lemke's daughter made a bad decision by walking out in the middle of the street, jaywalking, basically,
Sure.
you know.
Yeah. I think that the idea of unfairness in this novel comes from saying, well, Halleck is powerless to stop this curse, besides appealing to Lemke's human
Right.
attributes. But that's the thing, is that like that's what this book is about in a sense, is what power is. So power is, yes, mystical curses that you can put on people and end their lives, but power is also this other, like this power that's given to you by your status in life, by your lineage, by your heritage, by your skin color, by your wealth. That's the power that Halleck had. So who's to say, like, we talked a few minutes ago about maybe like would Lemke have been okay with society doing its thing against, maybe if society had used its power to punish Halleck, Lemke would have felt like, okay, it is a push, like this dude has been punished. But when he saw that society didn't use its power, he had to use his power. Like they're two separate powers, like power A, power B.
Mm-hmm.
And when power A is not exhibited, then Lemke's like, well, power B is coming into play now, because like somebody needs to have something happen to them. Like the guilt is not enough.
Yeah, exactly. Well, do you have any final thoughts on this? Do you rate your books after you read them? I'm on Goodreads, so I'm always doing this, but I'm just curious if it's something that you consider when you're reading.
I don't rate them.
Okay.
No, I kind of gauge how I was feeling at the end of it. Like, well, I won't spoil anything that you haven't gotten to yet, but like when I finished the shoot, I can never. Was it 11/23/63 or something like that? The
11/22
JFK book.
63. Yeah.
Ah, so close. I never get my numbers right.
There's a lot in that one.
Yeah, I mean that's a thick book, like, and I spent a long time reading that when I was still doing a lot of reading, and I got through it, and at the end of it, I was like, I closed it, and I felt like, okay, I read the Odyssey, like I read a book that means like that felt good, and I did Bag of Bones, another King book,
Okay.
which I really enjoyed, and I closed that book and was like, whew, all right, that was a journey, and a lot of cool concepts and things happened in there, a lot of interesting people, and ideas, and I'm into that. And when I closed this book, it felt like I was. Have you done Night Shift yet? The collection of short
Yes.
stories.
Yeah.
Have you talked about it in the show yet?
Yeah, it was episode 2, I want to say.
Okay.
That was a
Episode
very
2.
early
Wow. Okay.
collection.
That was early. So, I mean, think of, is it called The Boogeyman? His
Yeah.
story from that?
Yeah, that's one of the stories.
So that one, like the character of the Boogeyman kind of walks out of the closet and has that chilling line, like, so nice or something like that, as he's walking out of the closet in The Boogeyman. And I remember I read that as a sophomore in high school, and I felt the same thing that I felt as I closed Thinner. Like I was like, like I know how this is ending, and like we discussed, King is ending the book when there's really no other possible outcome to this story, and that's an unsettling feeling. It's very not subversive because you kind of knew it was coming and you knew there's kind of no other way to go, but it's not a feel good ending.
It's a heavy read.
Yeah, and so like I don't feel like it's good to gauge a book on whether it has a happy ending or not. I think that's completely incorrect to do.
Right.
But I will say it was not as enjoyable for me because of the fact that
It sucked a lot out of you.
that your protagonist, you just feel deflated in the end and you feel tired. And like even if Stephen King did write this book out of the question of what would happen if I kept losing weight even after they told me to, like he's touched on so many important questions about violence and violence in the name of other violence or revenge and law and the 1%, even though that probably wasn't a huge concern back then. Like it's an important book. So like I think all of his books, except for one of the more recent ones, I did not enjoy the kind of the pulpy, like Welcome to Wonderland or something like that, or it was like it's a more recent one of his books that he wrote.
Okay.
But kind of a detective novella, like nothing. It was not very mystical. It was just a straight up murder mystery.
Was it Joyland or the Colorado Kid?
Yeah,
Okay.
Joyland. I think it was Joyland. It was about the amusement park. Yeah, that book didn't do it for me in the same way that all his other books did. But I think it's because he was going for something very specific. And when I read King, I'm going for this book, Thinner. So like, yeah, like very roundabout way of me saying I enjoyed the book. Didn't make me feel good, but I recognize the importance of it, and I think that it is a good read. And if you feel like torturing yourself, not in a way that like it's hard, not in a sense that it's hard to read, or like it's not like this is not Gravity's Rainbow we're talking about here, but like in a way that you want to test your ability to feel good while reading, this is definitely a great book to do that with.
Yeah, I thought because of the back half being a much better pace than the first half, I was like, oh, right. For me, this is like a 7 out of 10, basically. And that's not bad at all.
7 out of 10.
For me,
Yeah.
like anything that's a 3 out of 5 or, 6 out of 10 and above, that's a solid book. And, he is going to have books throughout this process, for me, at least, like you, that I find more enjoyable than others. Even if the content itself isn't like fun and enjoyable, you can still enjoy a book that is like very, very dark. And a lot of his books are that way.
What would you say is a 10 out of 10 for you?
Oh, I think I gave The Stand a 10 out of 10 just because he does so much great character work in that with so many different characters. Even though with that, I think it had the same problem that this book did, where it was a little slow to get into. And then once you sort of get to know the characters a little more, it moved at a much faster pace.
I think for me, I was waiting for this book to take a completely hand turn. Like, I think a lot of things that happen in King, like in 11/22/63. Did I get that?
There we go.
Yeah, hey, nice. I should just say November 22nd, 1963. That would be a lot easier. Like in the JFK book, like that takes a left turn at the end. Like you think it's a story about one thing, and then in an almost epilogue fashion, like you just come back to it, and you're like, oh, whoa, there's something happening. Like from a Buick 8, like that. Mm-hmm. If you haven't read a Buick 8 yet, that takes a huge left-hand turn at the end of it. I feel like Tommy Knockers almost does that too.
Okay. You've read a lot more King than I expected, honestly.
Yeah, no, I have to say he's probably, besides, my Animorphs collection from when I was in middle school, King is probably who I've read the most of. Like, I've read a lot of King. I believe it or not, as much as anybody who listens to Bantha Fodder, the Star Wars podcast I do with Jacob Tender, or listening to me talking about reading in this, or I think we've probably mentioned how bad I am at reading in now. Like it's in Welcome to Geekdom. Like this is, I used to read a lot, and a lot of the times it was Stephen King, and my mom really encouraged that. She's a big reader and was a King fan. So it would just, I'd be like, I think I want to read Stephen King. I think I want to try scaring myself. And she'd be like, okay. And she'd get me Christine. That was my first Stephen King book, and it was very interesting because I was probably like 13 or 14 around my, like where you start thinking about driving, and it was like some really adult themes in that book too, scenes. And I was like, wow, you can put that in the book? Like, oh my God. Like, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add. But there's 3. Oh, I found the word. Purpur Fargade and Siktet. That's the Romani word they use for the cursed child kind of thing.
I would have never remembered that.
I had it highlighted. Well, actually, it's one of the chapter titles, so that's kind of why it looks like that. So in that title called Purpur Fargade and Siktet, I don't know how I'm saying it, there are 3 lines that happen. I think this is also where he talks about the push, but there are 3 lines that I kind of think sum up the themes of this book. And that is Halleck talking to himself, and he says, because if you don't have someone to run out of town once in a while, how are you going to know if you yourself belong there? And I think that's the plight of the Romani in this book that King is trying to hammer home. And I feel like that was a very important quote. The second one I listed was, I think it's Lemke says this. He says, everybody pays even for things they didn't do, which is, we think about the daughter who got hit in the road. She didn't do anything. She got mowed down. Halleck thinks he's suffering unjustly. And it's like, yeah, well, you're suffering because of what happened to my people for all these years, because I have this power and your society didn't use this power, so I'm using it. And then Linda and Heidi are suffering for something she doesn't do. Heidi is suffering internally, even though she's not saying it. Heidi is suffering for the guilt that she's suppressing, like this guilt that she feels. She didn't hit the girl on the road, but she knows it's kind of something her fault and she has to suffer. So she didn't do it, but she still suffers for it. And her husband suffers, so she suffers. And Halleck is totally blind to that. Who else suffers in this for something they didn't do? The cop who gets the boils.
Yeah.
He suffers. He didn't kill the woman in the road, but, he had some hand in it. He drove the Romanis out of town, and he suffers for it. The judge turns into an alligator. His wife suffers for something she didn't do. It's just, I think everybody pays for things they didn't do. I think if you look at like natural disasters, like what happened in Mozambique recently, like people just suffer for things they didn't do, and that's just the way of life. Mm-hmm. And Halleck suffering from this curse is nothing, different than the way the world works. And I think that's ultimately, it's sort of like nihilistic if you look at it in a certain perspective, but it's King is hammering it home with Lemke here. And then the last quote I think is also Lemke, and he says, "Be careful who eats the meal that was meant for you." And this one for me was like, obviously the pie, Linda and Heidi eating the pie.
Yeah, that's sort of the dagger in the coffin for him too.
But also it ties into it's folded into the everybody pays line, because, who else is eating the meal that was meant for Halleck? The judge, his wife, his daughter. Janelli eats the meal that was meant for him. Janelli gets involved, and Janelli would be alive if it wasn't for Halleck. So all these people are just dying and suffering because Halleck just isn't just like, yeah, I killed a person, I gotta die. It's because he doesn't accept the fate that was dealt to him, that's heroic in a lot of other novels and in other contexts. But when you put it in the context of the Romani versus society, the American society, upper class society, that's it's not an admirable quality in this guy.
Right.
So thank you for having me on. Like,
yeah, of course.
I love analyzing literature like this, and if there are any other books, I should probably jump into this and do this. But
I can give you more homework if you want.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, 10 out of 10 for The Stand is high praise, so I think that's on the list. I've never read it, believe it or not. But the fact that I've read so much about the movie and in that sense been told the plot of it, I kind of feel like I don't have a lot to be revealed to me now that I know everything about like how it works.
Yeah. If it makes you feel better, the next available novel that hasn't been claimed is an episode for like the end of October. So if you end up signing for any other books, just know you will have ample time to get to them.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you again for letting me look at this and talk about these concepts, because I think after you read a book, all you want to do is talk about it with somebody.
Yeah.
Especially because I finished it literally yesterday.
That helps. It's fresh in your mind.
Yeah. We didn't wait like a month to record this, and I think that's awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. And I am always happy to podcast with you. It's always a fun conversation. And if anyone wants to keep up with the podcast on Twitter or Instagram, you can find us at Chat Sematary. As always, thank you all for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.